Hey everyone, welcome back to 123 Chess. My name is Luke,
I am Tom.
and we're here today to review our game 13, which was Pirc's Defense, a very unique and invigorating game for both of us. And so, Tom, would you like to start it off since you played as white?
Yeah, so I actually know that the Pierce defense is one of Luke's pet openings. He really likes playing it. And we've gone over a lot of openings at this point in time, but we had, I don't know, it had been a while. We were doing our own sort of independent studies, I guess. Uh, and I finally said, you know what? Like, I feel like I'm in a good spot. I know what I have a plan. I'd like to play a game with the Pierce defense. And so Luke was like, sure, yeah, happy to do it. And there we go. So I did a little bit of prep work going into this. I knew we were going to play the Pierce defense. And one of the things that had actually gotten me hyped up about it is I had been studying the French defense, and it was the advanced variation. And I mean, these are very different openings. They are, but just the idea of like I started to recognize in the French that like advancing my pawns down the center and creating that really strong central control with the push pawns was something that made me feel comfortable. I feel comfortable playing that sort of a game, and I thought to myself, well, maybe I could play a similar sort of a game with the Pierce defense, and I could feel some sort of comfort. And so that's kind of the game that I had been looking at. uh
And you totally
uh
killed it and caught me by surprise. I was like, what? I've never experienced this
yeah,
kind of response.
and so I kicked things off as you will with um king pawn opening. That's the way that I've been normally playing. And Luke responds again with the Pierce defense. So here we are. um and like I said, I wanted to establish a really strong control of the center. And I don't know, and like every single thing that I was watching in preparation for this, this D pawn kept coming out. And so I was just waiting for this moment for this D pawn to come out with the intention of like, well, I'm going to push that pawn and I'm going to get this, advanced variation of the Pierce defense. I don't know if that's a thing, but that's what I'm calling it.
Nice.
That was my plan. That was my plan. Uh, and so he does this first, and as soon as he does this, I'm instantly like, okay, now I've got to think. And so this took me really off guard. And the first thing that popped into my head was moving my knight out to c3 to defend, right?
Which is the main line.
Yeah, which is the main line. But the thing was, is I wanted to get into this sort of advanced variation, if you will, and I really wanted to push these central pawns forward, um, and I wanted help from my C pawn, and I knew if I moved my knight out, my C pawn wasn't going anywhere. And honestly, I feel like I've played a million games with Luke where I get into this sort of a trap where my knights get coaxed out, and I get ultimately into an uncomfortable position with my pawn structure that I don't like. And so I said, well, I don't need to move out that knight. Like I can defend this pawn in some other way, right? And so I said, how can I defend this pawn? Obviously, I could move my bishop out, my light square bishop. I can move my knight to d2, but instead I ended up landing on moving my pawn out. And part of the reason why I landed on moving my pawn out is actually because one of the things that I noticed about the Pierce defense is by pushing that D pawn forward instead of the E pawn on Luke's part, the only real minor piece that he activates in that opening is that light squared bishop. And that light squared bishop, it doesn't have a lot of squares to go to at this point in time with that pawn push because it can no longer land on g4.
Exactly.
So I really liked that I was shutting down this diagonal already. And so, and like I said, I'm going for this kind of like really strong centralized pawn structure. And I thought this is really going along with that sort of a plan, right? I'm still hoping that he's going to be pushing that e pawn forward eventually, and then I can push my d pawn, and we can get into that sort of a situation. So this is what I landed on. Of course, he's not pushing that d pawn. He's going for a fianchetto bishop, which is totally in line with everything that I expect Luke to be playing. But, you know, I get to do the thing that I was planning on at this moment, which was, you know, advance the c pawn.
We each get our plan.
Yeah, exactly. And so this happens, right? And I will say advancing the c pawn too is something that as I was really struggling with the playing against the Sicilian for a while, like I just hated seeing the Sicilian because I was always playing e4 openings. Eventually I got to this point where I was like, well, maybe I just need to abandon e4 altogether. And I started playing d4 for a while. So I got very comfortable with playing in sort of like a Queen's Gambit game and pushing that c pawn early on in the game. And I did find like a lot of real like advantageous play to having it out there. Really like it out there. So so this was well in my comfort zone. Now I get to put that knight out, and that seems like a much more opportune time because now it's no longer blocking that pawn. It's already out there. Okay, so castle. And then bringing my knight out. And my ultimate goal is actually to bring my knight over to g3.
Yep. Fortifying the center too.
So this happens, and when I bring my bishop out there, my plan actually wasn't for my bishop to stay there. I figured that a much more stable square would end up being e3, but my hope was that putting my bishop on g5 would coax Luke into maybe pushing his h-pawn forward and just ruining the pawn structure around his king a little bit. So this happens, and now I'm getting into a little bit more where I wanted to be. You know, I was planning on that e-pawn coming forward, hasn't happened, but that's okay. This is my time to push, and so I push, and I've got that nice strong central control, and I'm not worried about this pawn, you know, capturing into the middle now. As luck would have it, Luke pushes that pawn just like I wanted, and so I hop back to the square that I was planning on resting on. Knight pops out, and again, my knight goes to g3, which is where I was anticipating putting it. And then this pawn comes forward, and at this moment, this is where I started to, I played a move that I really would have been uncomfortable playing once upon a time. And this was a move. So this is the move that I made. I played at h4. And once upon a time, I would have looked at this move and I would have been like, oh, you know, I'm really wrecking my chances on castling on my king's side. However, the thing that I really liked about this move was I'm preventing his pawn from pushing forward, right? I don't want him to bully my knight around in this position. So that was one. Something that I ended up discussing with somebody in the chess club in Grand Rapids that I go to, which is the Grand Rapids Chess Center. He really liked this move, and he's a higher rated player than I am. He said that one of the things that he likes about this move is it really secures that h5 pawn in its place.
Yep.
And by doing that, it's forever not going to move forward anymore. So if I could theoretically get my knight out of the way, then I've got a pretty good game plan in terms of pushing my G pawn forward up to G4, and I'm going to have a nice little assault on his king side with that move. Pawn comes out, and furthering my development a little bit here, getting things out of the back row. And then Luke did this, threatening to break open the center. I certainly didn't want to capture. Again, I wanted to keep that tension going in the middle of the board.
Yep.
So just again, increase my options with castling, so I could castle on the queen side theoretically at this point. And then Luke did this, which I thought was interesting. So I take my opportunity to trade off that bishop. Which
it's a very interesting part of the game because we're playing on all sides of the board right now.
Yeah, we really are. Yeah. So this is, moment to take out this very powerful bishop. And Luke ends up breaking up the tension in the center, capturing that pawn. I capture the bishop before moving on. He has to retake. And then from here, I capture with my knight. And speaking of moves that once upon a time I would have felt very uncomfortable with, this is absolutely one of them, because now the obvious move, he can recapture my queen, right? And if he captures my queen, I lose all my chances of castling. But while once upon a time that would have scared the heck out of me, not being able to castle, one of the things that I recognize now is like, okay, but he's trading his queen for my queen. My rooks are both going to be connected in that back row. Like, I've got a solid pawn structure going for myself. Like, honestly, we're going to be moving into the end game before too long now that we're trading off these queens.
Yep.
So breaking up my castle really isn't that big of a deal at this point. And so he does.
There's another one of your side pawns again. Same idea.
Yep, launching for the side pawn. Obviously preventing the move B5, which probably would have been coming next, especially having put his rook onto B8. He does this, and then I do this, which effectively covers both of those pawns at the same time, right? I've taken out two of his pawns for one of my pawns. And this was a little move that I learned studying Silman's complete endgame that we've talked about in one of the past videos.
And I think he calls it a deep freeze.
Yep. So then the capture happens here. And honestly, I'm actually very happy with all of the play that I've done up until now. I'm if I were to do all of this again, I don't know that I would have changed a thing.
Yeah, you did really well.
This move, however, it turned out to be my big takeaway. I ended up capturing with this pawn. And I think a big reason why I'm capturing with this pawn is really with this intention of like, well, I've got all this stuff going on the queen side of the board, right? And I've got that kind of thing locked down. And so I'm, bringing more material over to there. But it's kind of an illusion. Like that's not really what's happening. I don't need another pawn over there. I don't need another pawn on that side of the board to do anything. I've got that controlled with the material that I have over there.
Right.
In fact, now my next step is really like what I talked about, getting this knight out of here, right? Pushing this pawn forward, and then taking all these pawns and be launching an assault over here on the king side, right? And now I can put pressure on this side, and I've got minimal pieces that are locking down this side of the board. The other thing that's really cool is if I had captured here.
Look at your pawn structure.
Oh, the pawn structure is phenomenal. But the thing that is super cool is now I really have prevented this move.
Mm-hmm.
And I've prevented this move because capture, that's not defending this pawn. It's not defending this pawn because I got this pawn out of the way
Yep.
of this bishop. So actually, I ended up, while I'm thinking, while I said it was an illusion, right? I'm thinking that I'm doing more good for my queen side by capturing this way. In actuality, I did more harm for my queen side by capturing that way. And simple takeaway from this whole thing, because this was a hard part for me, was trying to make some sense of this move and trying to think like, okay, well, what's the lesson? What's the lesson that I learn here, right? It's pretty simple. Capture toward the center, right?
Yep.
I mean, why didn't I capture toward the center? I didn't have a good reason to not capture toward the center.
Yeah, so that you have 2 pawns in the center. And then it also opens up your bishop too.
And it does, and opening up my bishop line. I think
like the principle of, how can I improve one of my pieces?
Yep. So yeah, if I were to do it again, I would definitely capture with that pawn. So this ended up happening, and then he gets that pawn push, right? But my pawn is in the way, so now he can do it.
Yep.
Take. And then I get into here. And I mean, honestly, this ended up being a whole heap of trouble for me. This was a problem for me, a real problem. And honestly, I do think that Luke, if he had done a move that he ended up doing down the road, if he had seen the move earlier,
yep.
I think he probably would have ended up just winning the game, because he had that break on this side. And he brings that rook over. I defend with the pawn, which is okay, but my rook's kind of stuck over there on that side of the board at this moment. Now this happened, and when this happened, I finally felt like, yay, like I got a break. I caught my break.
Mm-hmm.
And this was probably Luke's big move that he's like,
yeah, it was horrible. I mean, I knew my reasons for it, but which I'll discuss. But yeah, it was just it was just clearly forgetting that of why it was there in the first place, to guard that square.
Yeah, so that pawn that piece had been guarding the square very well, right? Now that it's gone, I just hop up into it. And that seems like a really good place for my knight, right? Because now I've got a threat on this pawn back here, right? And I'm also covering 2 squares around the king, right? I'm in the center of the board. This is great position for my knight to be. And then Luke goes here, and I see like what Luke's probably figuring is he wants to cover that pawn, so he can move this rook, and so that rook is not on guard duty from that square. But like I said, game plan, moving this knight, that's what I wanted to do, because once I move that knight, I can launch this pawn forward and start an assault on the king side. And I really liked this move. I was really excited about
that really scared me.
Yeah, and so now I've got a counterattack going. And this was kind of something that it was a big lesson that I learned probably my last game that I played Luke. We had there were a lot of pieces that were traded off, and I was at a big disadvantage. And then nearing the end of the game, I really started to counterattack. I don't even remember what game this was, Luke, but I really started to counterattack
Yeah.
with the little bit of material that I had. And that was the one time that I started to get Luke on the run a little bit, and I started to make him a little bit more nervous. And one of my big takeaways in that game was like, you know,
Counterattack.
I've got to counterattack. I can't just play so defensively all the time, which is kind of weird for me if you've been following the channel for a while, because
We've changed.
we have. When I first started playing, I was like attack, 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 attack. I need to get away from attack, 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 attack. Well, I went too far. The pendulum went too far the other way, and I just started defending every position, and I started just responding to all of Luke's attacks without making any threats of my own. And so it was a real good takeaway of like, I need to find my opportunities to have decisive attacks to make it so Luke is no longer the only one presenting any sort of a threat. He needs to be able to respond to my threats too. And that's what this move really accomplished here. And, you know, Luke ends up pulling his rook over to this side, which may or may not have been the best move, but it was certainly a tempting move, nevertheless. I pushed this pawn forward.
Just locking it in.
Yep. Pawn goes back, continuing with plan. Just moving these pieces forward. And this is the move.
Yeah, way too late. I'll discuss that in mine.
Yeah, this is the move that was bound to come. I was not excited to see it because this you know, in terms of counterattack, right? All of a sudden the play shifts to this side of the board, and I have to respond to these threats. This happened, and I did this move here. And then I thought I was okay here. And then Luke shook my world by taking this. I was not prepared for him to make this trade at all. But I ended up really liking it. I mean, not for myself. I didn't like it for myself. I really liked it for Luke. I thought it was well thought out, a very good move, because he takes this pawn and my position is kind of falling apart here to a very large extent. I had to play really cautiously because there end up being a lot of like tactical ideas that Luke can come up with from this position.
I had so many traps for you. You didn't fall for a single one of them.
Yeah. And maybe Luke will go over. Are you going to go over your lines that you had potential?
You know, I was going to, but I think I'm going to focus on prior moves that I should have done differently. But
Okay.
but needless to say, it was definitely an exciting part of the game here.
Yeah, and there is honestly a lot here that if I did not play carefully, I could have gotten into big trouble. You know what, Luke?
Yeah.
I actually think this move here might have been so. I don't know if anybody who's following along, you might notice I don't have any notes in my game. I don't have any notes because the notes that I typed up, I apparently didn't save them and they got deleted, which is really sad.
No.
Really sad, yeah. But I actually think that this was one of my moves that I didn't need to do, and I could have done more in terms of developing some sort of a counterattack at this point. Because I went here with the anticipation of defending this square. Yes, this was my takeaway. See, I just had to talk through it a little bit. My takeaway was the move that I was really afraid of was this. Oops. Oh, let me just do some random move. Right. There's not a lot of good random moves.
I know it's not a random move. Hence the craziness of this game.
Hence the craziness of this game. I'm just gonna do this. That's probably a terrible move. Okay, it's probably just awful. Nope. That gets away from the thing. So this move here, that seems decent at first glance. The move that I was really afraid of was this move here. But the takeaway that I needed to figure out was when you're checked, when your king is checked with a knight, that knight is always in striking distance of the king after one move. Presuming your king can go to that square, right? So this move here ends up being a pretty good move because now I'm threatening to recapture the knight. And I don't know. Like I have not evaluated this position. I mean, I had kind of taken pieces of the analysis. So maybe something like this could happen. I don't know, right? But this is no longer really a threat if this is something I'm scared of, right? Because the knight is now hanging.
Right.
And so and you know, anything, right? You've got to get your rook to safety now, right? You checked me. So certainly like that was my big takeaway is that move was a paper tiger. That move was a paper tiger because again, the takeaway that a knight is always within striking distance of the king.
So then it's a double attack on my rook and my knight.
So then it's a double attack. Exactly. So yeah, and that was why I moved my rook back here. I moved my rook back here with the intention of being able to cover that square. But I think it ended up being a little bit of a wasted move. Dropping my knight back here, this I believe was required. I think I had to drop my knight.
This was a fantastic move. This move shut down my chances of trying to find a line to mate you.
Yeah, and you know, if you're watching at home, since Luke said he's probably not going to go over all of the lines that he had here, it might be a good exercise if you don't see why this was a good move, to back it up and do some other move, right? Do some other move here and see what potentials are out there if I didn't bring my knight back.
Yep.
Because there's a lot. This was a scary square here for his knight to move to.
And just to give you guys some context, the reason why I made that really what might have seemed like a crazy decision to be down in exchange is I recognized that Tom's rook was stuck on A2 temporarily. So I thought, okay, if I can take away some of his pawn defense, if I can somehow bring my knights close to his king, then I could actually make the case for perhaps my knight being stronger than his rook.
Yeah. This happens. Then
we get
we get this. And then we get a perpetual. And this is how the game ended, which
we were both happy with.
We were both happy with. You know, I mean, I did have a slight material advantage at this point in time, right? So, I mean, I think that a grandmaster would probably look at this position and be like, "No, I'm gonna play as white. I'm not gonna go into the perpetual." But
we tried it, and it was insane.
It got pretty crazy pretty fast. And from my perspective, Luke is a better player than me. Luke is
you give me too much credit, but
Luke is certainly higher rated than I am, and from my perspective, getting a draw against a higher player is a good, acceptable way to play. So that's what I wanted to do. I was like, I'm gonna go for a draw if I can get a draw here, and so Luke gave it to me, and I loved this game. It was one of my favorite games of chess I've ever played.
Me too. Yeah. It was really rad. I loved it.
So
Yeah.
That was so my big takeaways were a knight when you're checked, right? When you're checked with a knight, that knight is always one move in striking distance of the king after one move. And then the other one was have a good reason not to take into the center with a pawn, especially if it's freeing up a bishop line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, I mean, I think if I had caught especially that pawn move, I think I would have been in a much stronger position with that pawn move.
Oh yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, we certainly each had moments in this game where we each could have taken it. So it was it could have gone either way for sure.
Yep.
Cool.
But yeah, those were my takeaways. So I will bring it back, flip the board, and Luke will go over his game.
All right, here we go. So, so yeah, obviously Tom opened with his traditional E4, and this is my jam. These days, 9 out of 10 times, if they play E4, I'm gonna play D6. It's because it's not too familiar. Most people are not very aware of how to play around it, and it just kind of catches people off guard. And it's a counterplay attack opening, so it's really fun as it gets toward the mid game usually. And so he goes here. This is the main line still. This is not the main line. And Tom mentioned how, so this is called the lion's jaw variation. And as Tom mentioned, the traditional approach is for the knight to be brought out to guard the pawn. But this approach is equally valid. And it's funny too, because the reasoning Tom had in doing this is, generally speaking, the primary reason why this would be done, and that is you can get your C pawn out. So then after we get, and again, when I'm playing here, this is all kind of traditional Pirc's defense. You most of the time fianchetto your bishop on the king side. So now, yep, we said the C pawn coming out there. Okay, and then he brings the knight behind. That knight loves to get behind the C pawn. So I decide to castle. Now this right here, as soon as, I should go ahead and say that as soon as this C pawn comes out, we're no longer in Pirc's defense territory. We're now in King's Indian defense. So again, if players are preferring to have more of a central control early on like this, then the C pawn being out early is the reasoning behind that F3 pawn being moved instead of the knight. And so now, so basically, even, you know, whether or not Tom was trying to go like King's Indian defense per se, that's exactly kind of what he intended as well. And so it worked out great for him. Okay, so then at this point, the question starts to become, when do I break in the center? Because at some point I have to break in the center, and it has to be at the right time. This is where grandmasters, like, if you actually look up the Pirc's defense, you'll find grandmasters like Garry Kasparov that kind of poo-poo it, and they say, nah, I don't really play it, because the reasoning for that is because it gives white so many different options, right? So and it really, black has to be really super careful, because the nuance of when and how to break in the center is really crucial. If you haven't gotten familiar with it, with the Pircs, then you could be in trouble. And the same can be said of the King's Indian defense, which we have here. So he brings his, this was kind of clever. Like I wasn't actually expecting this one. And well, it makes perfect sense, because, you know, there's plenty of options. Bringing the knight here, for instance, places more, you know, coverage for this pawn. I mean, that's not necessarily what he had in mind, but it's a really good move all the same. So again, I'm trying to think, when am I going to break in the center? So this is a pretty common maneuver. I recognize that my bishop is kind of, you know, can't really go anywhere right now, and I would like to break in the center, but I'm not just gonna, I don't want to break in the center without support. So that's why this kind of comes back to, when it comes to like King's Indian defense or Pirc's defense, these kind of openings with a fianchettoed king side bishop and this kind of pawn structure, you really have to make a determination. Like, what is your play style? For me, I prefer to break in the C file. just because, like Tom said, you know, you're attacking toward the center. And so if the opponent takes your pawn, they're attacking away from the center. Now, again, it's just a principle. Like anything in chess, it doesn't always apply. But generally speaking, it's easier, especially if this bishop comes out here to potentially pin, because then if this pawn moves up, well, guess what? My knight's pinned to my queen. Which, ironically enough, that's exactly what Tom plays next. So again, this is already why I was thinking the prior move, I want to break here and not here, because I didn't want to place myself in a pin. So then Tom advances it, which again, you know, just solid move. I mean, he could have left it. He could have. There's a lot of options he had, but what he did, I think, is just thematic for his play style, as well as just a solid control of the center. All right, so then I decide I'm going to kick that bishop. And it's also, it's arguably, it's kind of ambiguous whether that weakens my king side too much, because a lot of players you'll see doing this kind of move with their pawn in the Pirc like super early, but they just have to know how to approach the different pawn advances. One of the coolest things about the Pirc for me is it really taught me to understand pawn breaks and the consequences of pawn movement, which I think, Tom, we had agreed months ago that that's one of the main things we each got better in, is understand pawn movement. Okay, so let's move on here. And this is that brilliant move that Tom mentioned where he played here. And so, you know, everything is kind of going to his plan so far. And I'm basically just kind of playing decent and looking for an opportunity as time arises. So I'm trying to play. I like playing on like both sides of the board at the same time, because then it kind of keeps the opponent guessing. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. Okay. All right, here we go. Critical moment number 1. So it can almost go without being said that usually when you're getting ready to make a pawn break in the center, you want to know what things will look like after that happens. So in this case, what I mean is, as soon as, let's say I were to just do something else, like move this pawn. If Tom takes my pawn, I have to really kind of grasp what the reality will be with this backward pawn. So again, backward pawns, you know, can be a weakness, and you just have to understand, am I going to be able to protect it? Is it going to be a weakness for me or an advantage to open up my pieces and attack? So that was what I was thinking at this point. The move I went with was to move my queen here. And Tom mentioned that after we get this series of moves, it actually ended up with his king being in a slightly, you know, arguably stronger spot. So it turned out, you know, even, but even possibly Tom slightly better. And for sure slightly better as soon as this happened and I moved my knight back. So so going back to the critical moment now, let's take a dive into this to see what I learned from it. So again, I wasn't sure what the best order of operations would be. I saw my queen was right here, and that she could potentially plop over to here or even over to here. So I saw that, and I also saw that, you know, I saw that this obviously was some tension, and I was trying to determine, was it advantageous for me to start that exchange or for Tom to? And I thought that it would be more for me to, but again, when I did this, it allowed the counterplay to kind of unfold and kind of pull the rug out from under me. But there's actually a much simpler idea that I didn't realize when I was looking at this position. And this kind of piggybacks off something you said, Tom, in yours. So what I could have done, now I mentioned how this move that I did is actually a Zwischenzug. It's kind of like not the expected first move. This is one of my takeaways too. Like, just because you have an intermezzo move, just because you have a Zwischenzug, doesn't mean you need to play it. Like, it doesn't always mean it's the best move. It might seem cool, you can do it, But in this case, the simplest move for me to continue and play for an advantage is just to take. Now, again, this is super early in the game, and already here, as I'm gonna show you, that no matter what white does, black is gonna come out with a slight advantage after this exchange. So Tom, you mentioned the theme of taking in with this pawn instead of the other. So now let's look at what the consequences here for both of us after that happens. So instantly, once that pawn moves here, do you notice how it opens up this square for my pawn? So now all of a sudden I can jam my pawn up, and all of a sudden I have control over the whole queen side. And now obviously, there's not really an attack yet, but if I play carefully, I can move my queen in, and I can get my bishop. I can either fianchetto him or more likely move it on here. I can also threaten to advance here or plot my knight here with the double attack on the queen and bishop. I can also move this at the right time. So there's tons of options, and it all revolves around the fact that in this weird case, taking toward the center actually gave me more space on the queen side. It gave up a crucial square so that I'm now dominating the queen side. Now, again, what Tom mentioned was, worked because this queen had already come out. And so I'd already kind of done the wrong order of operations. And like he mentioned, taking toward here would have pretty much won him the game potentially if played well by both of us after. But in this case, it doesn't matter because I didn't move my queen yet, and I didn't waste that move, but instead I spent that move on the crucial moment where I forced him to now decide what he's going to do. Now, if you take this way, all of a sudden this pawn can come up now, and I can literally start attacking on the same side as my king. And so, arguably the best move probably still would have been the pawn, the same pawn Tom mentioned. So
I'm wondering because actually I probably would have taken with my knight.
Okay, yeah.
Did
So
you look at that one?
Yes. So let's look at the knight now. All right. So now I don't want to put you in the spot, Tom, because I looked at this and you didn't look in depth
Yeah.
with it. But let me just ask you, what would you? So after this move, right? I'm going to go ahead and just take you. Now, what are you going to do?
I mean, off the top of my head, I would say probably keep the same sort of a theme going and recapture with the C pawn.
Exactly. And in looking at the engine, that did tend to be the best of the options. So this pretty much the same dynamics as we just looked at, but the difference is there's a knight less. But again, here we go. Same theme, same exact thing. Now I understand that this pawn can get rolling too, but keep in mind I'm castled and white is not.
Right.
So that already,
and the queens didn't get traded off the board, because that's
correct.
the big difference from our position is now the queens are on the board, and the castle, me not having castled, is a bigger deal.
Absolutely. So right here, and just to put it in perspective, black is, no matter how you look at this, whether it was taking with the knight or one of the two pawns, either way, I'm going to either gain space on this side of the board or this side of the board with white not having castled yet, with queens on the board. All of those dynamics together caused me to actually have a 1.5 to 2 point evaluation advantage. And it's not like one of those dumb, engine things where you're like, how in the world am I better? Like, it's pretty obvious. But it all stems from the fact that I didn't do the fancy Zwischenzug, but instead I just did the logical, I'm going to make you make the decision. But unfortunately, there's no good decision. It's kind of like a Zugzwang, honestly, because at this point, that's what I didn't realize. Like, I had no idea that right here, instead of moving my queen, I was trying to find a good move, and I didn't realize that this white doesn't want to take it with anything because it gives me space no matter how you look at it. And I just didn't look. It's like we talked about before, Tom. Not looking a couple moves ahead when it's crucial to do so. So anyway, so Tom mentioned the moment where he would have probably gone on to win a game. This is the equivalent moment for me if I had done that. But that's not how it happened. So let's go on and I'll show you my next moments. So we get to this point, which again, I honestly would rather have white here. And I don't think it's a surprise why. Okay, so we get to this point. Yeah, everything I'm just like playing. I'm trying to find a way to get into his position. It's just like impossible. Um, so we get to this. Okay. So it's pretty clear here where my attack is. Tom mentioned how, this file is where all of my firepower is. So now, but again, to be clear, the critical moment we just looked at before earlier on, if I had found that, I would have gone on to probably, hopefully win if we each of us had played well. I would have just had a solid advantage, space advantage, development advantage. In this case, even if I did this properly, it still would have been a complicated game. There's no getting out of the complications from this point on. We got here and we're here to stay. So it is too late for any simplification options, but my assessment of the position, see, here's the thing. I had an attack, and this is what we talked about before. When you have an attack, don't go back on your attack. I feel like a broken record, Tom.
Yeah.
If you guys look at our previous videos or my blog, you'll see this is like constantly a theme that I'm saying, because it's so hard. You get scared about some, or you're like, you can't find like a definite line, and yet in this case, that's where I put all my eggs in that basket, and I just didn't even do anything with it. Instead, I let this kind of thing happen where I let him invade my position. Then he starts a counterplay attack, and then I evade it entirely. But what I should have done, okay, so in this critical moment, Tom already mentioned what the move that was the obvious one. That was here. Now, but let's see why this is effective. Now, when I looked at it, I thought, yeah, it's going to fizzle out. Like, what's it going to do? But actually, it's going to do a lot, and I'll show you why. So instead of just going through a million different lines, I think I'm going to show you the principles and those, because those kind of guide the whole thing. So the problem for white is that the king has one of two moves. And if the king moves here, well, then obviously this pawn is hanging because only one rook is guarding it. And if the king moves here, well, then the problem is Tom, you talked about an illusion on another position. This is kind of an illusion for white being able to take this pawn. It's kind of a decoy because of the two rooks working in tandem on the file. The king is overextended guarding the c4 and b2. And so, because the king is guarding these two squares, and once backing up, he'll get away from one of them. And the rook can't capture this pawn because then I'll get him with check and just take a free pawn. Then in addition to that, the c4 pawn, let me show you something else real quick. So, all right, so let's say the king goes here, right? And then once that happens, then let's say, let's go right here. So now you can already see I'm just invading for free, and there's not really anything that white can do because this can't really happen yet. Now there's also another tricky thing too, and that is what would you do here as white, Tom?
Jeez, I don't know. I feel like the position is just really starting to fall apart here.
I kind of feel one of thought is I kind of feel like just a simple rook move like this. I know it's
Yeah,
defensive, but
I almost would have said actually rook to. Oh yeah, probably because that frees up the other rook.
That's
Yeah,
kind of what I was thinking.
yeah, I like that. Because I was thinking maybe double up the rooks on the A file, but no, because you're still having the problem of you can't move the other rook. So I think that's probably the best way to go.
Yeah. So, and then check this out. So this is so weird, but this right here is an option now. Isn't that weird?
That is weird because take with the pawn. I'm guessing. Oh yeah. Yep.
It's crazy. So this is the problem is once that see I didn't see any of these things when we were
Yeah,
playing. I didn't realize how powerful it was because of, there's that move and there's also another trick. So let me see if I can find it. There's okay, so but if you let's say you were trying to be proactive and you knew you'd probably lose this pawn, but at least you realize that you could get your king back if you needed to, then you might do something like this. um
sure.
and then let's say, I don't know, let's say I go for, actually, you know what? I think that's the next position. There's a nuance different that allows me a tactic. But okay, so yeah, so that was if the king went there. If the king goes here, well then again, you can just kind of do this. Then I mean, you could play defensive and just kind of drop back and say, justify like taking a free pawn, or you could try to play for some tactics. We already mentioned the rook here or the knight here. So there's some maneuvers that I could do. I'd have to come up with a plan, or I could have just dropped back to here. So the point is there's not really much counterplay white can kind of unlock here. Um, so let's look at the next position, which is almost, so we go through a few moves here and things kind of, the board opens up a bit. And this right here, this would have been my last chance to successfully do this same attack. If I didn't, so when I did it, it was far too late. It was not, all the things good about it just wouldn't have been there, and they weren't. But in this case, I still had one last chance. And so this is it. Now, this is similar to the previous line, except the difference is that my knight on c7 is already defending this pawn, which is why I had moved it there in the first place. And then also, this is the other thing I was going to mention. So there's a difference also where it adds another tactical resource to the position when after Tom goes, let's say here, and then I go here. Again, the rook can't do anything there. So if I go there, now all of a sudden, pop, and I snatch a pawn. So that is another interesting thing. And it also, it happens to be interesting too, because, this pawn's hanging, I could double up, threatening to take this, things are just kind of falling apart for white's defense. So that was kind of again, that position and the previous one are both really similar. But my point here was this was the last chance that I had to successfully do this attack. So as the game went, we got to this point and I finally did it. But at this point, there's nothing going for me. Why? Because this file's already unlocked for Tom's, this file for Tom's rook is already unlocked. These pawns have been exchanged away. And there's just, the only reason why this attack was solid earlier is because the board was closed up on my side. I had the control over the only side opening up. And so that was kind of like Tom already mentioned, that was the threat. And I was too timid. I got scared. And by the time I did it, then I had to go for this crazy line of a piece exchange down, but which turned out okay for me, but it was certainly not ideal. And white was definitely had the upper hand. And then, yeah, like Tom mentioned, how we get to this point and so earlier on, yeah, so there's a lot going on here. And the point is, first of all, this might have been tempting for someone to move here. But then all of a sudden my knight plops in here. So, and Tom mentioned how if you guys didn't yet, when Tom said to go back and look at it, I'm gonna spoil it and show you, but yeah, go back and look at it if you don't want the spoiler first. So this move right here, when Tom moved that knight, that is what sealed my fate from even an opportunity to go for a win. Why? Because I could have gone, instead of if let's say Tom went, I don't know, let's just do a dumb move. All of a sudden I'm popping in, and once I come in here, my knights are pretty stinking powerful. I mean, everything has to be super cautious in White's perspective, because there's a lot of options here, and it all revolves around knights being super close to the king, and there being no easy way to avoid it. And there's even potential mating webs that can be formed, but I have to be careful too. But you could definitely make the case for knights being more powerful than a rook in this point. So that was pretty much it. So I think my biggest key takeaways were, number one, when I already have a slight advantage of some sort, if an option to simplify the position exists, it's usually the wisest, unless there's a definitive line that will cause me to have like an attack. So, rewinding back to the first of the three critical moments, which was right here, instead of moving the queen, just a simpler route works best. And it's simple because I'm the one who's castled, and so I'm the one who gets to decide, to open it up. And once it opens, I'm the one who gets the space. And so the spatial advantage plus castling plus queens on the board together make it good enough to justify me doing this in an early way, and I should go on to have an advantage for quite some time. And then my second takeaway was, when I've developed a plan of attack, I need to not deviate from it unless I have a better reason to do so. And then my last is, when I've developed a plan of attack, I need to calculate deeper lines into the attack in order to have confidence to build, to do it successfully. I didn't calculate the lines once we got further in the game and I got to the point of actually getting my rooks on that file. Because once I did, what I should have done is been spending all of my time, like when Tom's taking his turns, looking at, okay, if I go here, what happens when he goes here? What happens when he goes here? And then recognize that this pawn is not truly hanging, because then it leaves this pawn hanging. And that if he brings this pawn in, then I can all of a sudden bring another knight, and after my rook is here, snatch here, threatening to take here. And so the point is, there's no way for White to defend against it successfully. So that was mine, Tom.
I like it. It was an awesome game.
It was super fun. Oh my goodness, we learned a lot. So now that we've gone through our reviews, shall we try to see if we can remember the Grandmaster game that had a similar pawn structure?
Yeah.
All right.
All right, kicking it off. Already move one different from what we played.
Which is so funny. And this just goes to show you that sometimes the same pawn structure you get in a game at our level can be arrived at from many different places, many different ways. And in this case, it was arrived at from a queen's pawn game,
Yeah.
which is a traditional king's Indian defense already.
Which I think that really like hits up kind of what I feel it has been an overall takeaway for me in my gameplay is, in the opening, if you're taking away something in the opening, it's identify the games that you like to play, like identify where your comfort zone is and figure out how to force your opponent down a line that you're more comfortable with.
Yep.
Play the game that you want to play.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be like the quote unquote best opening either. Like, just because everyone and their second cousin are playing the Sicilian defense doesn't mean you have to. And in my case, the Pirc defense is what I like best. And in Tom's case, he knows how he wants to pawn structure. And it turns out, with the C pawn up there, it's just kind of like a better version for him, which is just super solid. So we each kind of knew what we wanted to play for.
So this about this for a second.
This is already traditional King's Indian defense. So it's not as common as some others, but with this bishop here, it's just crying out for the queen to line up and double. Okay, so now black goes here.
And the advance does not happen first.
Yeah, kind of an interesting setup. Okay, there's that similar idea. So that this is, aside from the bishop being here, this is still really similar to our game in how it looks.
And then here, I advance this pawn after this pawn push. That's not what happens though.
And it's kind of interesting too, because white shows that there's other ways to approach it as well.
Yeah.
I honestly, I think Tom's way was best, but you did better than a grandmaster, Tom.
Yeah, that's my claim to fame. Sorry, I've got some battery troubles. There we go. There, I think I've maybe solved it.
Nice.
Sorry, maybe just wiggling my computer. I've got a bad connection on my cord here.
Oh no.
All right, I think I got it.
You got it? Cool. Okay, so yeah, then white backs up there, which is very interesting. So now black goes for an early attack with the center. Okay, and again, that we talked about, that's what I should have done earlier in our position. Obviously it's different here, but it accomplished the same thing. Remember, Tom, how I mentioned these squares? So black is going to get an advantage in space there. But
well, and this sort of pawn push, when I was discussing this at my chess club, this is what somebody said was actually pretty common in this sort of a game, is pushing the pawns on the queen side.
Yeah.
From here though,
yeah. And even though this is a threat here, it's still advantageous for black to continue with this push, because now that space has been obtained. Except the next move, yeah, I don't think this one was good. I didn't look at it in the engine, but I would gather that is at least an inaccuracy, if not a mistake, because it doesn't accomplish anything, and it's bad. Like, I don't know how else to put it. All right, and now we're going to just trying to, that dumb knight is trying to find a good spot, but the pawn structure, just like yours, that pawn structure is just gnarly. Okay, now the queen gets out of the way, or goes to defend the pawn. Yeah, that move and this move, I don't know about these. That knight has moved around so much.
So many times. That knight has gone everywhere. Then I believe this right here.
Yep. And then fortifying that B pawn. See, that pawn wouldn't have to have been fortified if it wasn't moved again. Okay. Threatening to take here. And I like this little series of exchanges where there are tons of intermezzo moves, like in between moves, trying to get like an extra pawn here and there.
Yeah, this was a really interesting series of exchanges. I mean, the whole everything just like boom simplifies down this.
It just goes to show you that if you calculate a line and you see it through to its fullest extent, like after the exchanges have happened, it can really help, again, simplify things for you, so you don't have to get into some complex, crazy position. See, if that was me, I almost would have just kept my rook doubled up or something like that.
Yeah.
Or behind my queen. I don't know, because white already had such an advantage there, but obviously this turned out pretty awesome for white. I like how it's just taunting the knight to go there.
Yep.
And then after here, guess what? Black resigned. Yeah. So again, this just goes to show you, like Tom mentioned, you know, when you're playing for the sort of opening like pawn structure and position that you want to get, it can be arrived at from many different ways. In this case, it was a traditional King's Indian defense from like move 2, but then in our game, it was a Pirc defense, which Tom transposed into the same King's Indian defense. So it just goes to show you, you can do it many ways. It's like living in LA where I used to be. You know, there's a million different ways, million different highways and freeways to get to like the same place. But once you know those, boy, it sure helps you out because you can be more comfortable when you play. Um, and as usual, you guys, we will make sure to put in the comments in the video description the moves of this Grandmaster game, and then I'll put a link to my blog for my review. But yeah, this has been great, and I hope you guys have benefited from this. I know we have, and had a blast in the process. Anything else you want to add, Tom?
I don't think so. Keep practicing.
All right, thanks, guys. See you next time. Bye.